The heavy glass doors of Bella Vista restaurant swung open with such force that the hostess nearly dropped her reservation book, and in walked Marcus Whitfield like a thundercloud ready to unleash chaos on everyone below. His black suit cost more than most people earned in 6 months. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor with sharp precision, and his cold gray eyes swept across the dining room as if he owned not just the building but every soul inside it. The Mater D. Thomas had worked at Bella Vista for 15 years and had seen his share of powerful men. But something about Marcus tonight felt different, more dangerous, like a wild animal backed into a corner. Thomas approached with his practiced smile, but Marcus barely glanced at him before snapping, "My usual table, now, and make sure the wine is already breathing when I sit down." The entire restaurant seemed to shift as word spread silently among the staff that Marcus Whitfield had arrived, and not in a good mood. Servers who had dealt with him before began whispering urgent warnings to newer employees about his impossible demands and cruel tongue. How he once made a busboy cry for not polishing water glasses to his satisfaction. How he tipped generously, but only after making sure everyone knew they had suffered for it. Marcus stalked toward his corner table, the best seat in the house, with a view of both the kitchen and the main dining area. Perfect for someone who wanted to watch and control everything around him. His phone buzzed constantly with messages about his failing tech company's stock, news that his latest product launch had been delayed again, and urgent requests from investors who were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Tonight was supposed to be his chance to secure new funding, to convince 3 wealthy investors that his company was still worth their money. But the stress was eating him alive from the inside. He yanked out his chair so hard it scraped against the floor, making nearby diners flinch, then immediately began his usual routine of finding fault with everything. The table setting was wrong, the lighting was too dim, the music was too loud, and where was his wine that he had specifically requested be ready upon his arrival? Thomas hurried over with the bottle, hands slightly shaking as he poured, but Marcus waved him away dismissively before the glass was even half full. Across the dining room, Amara Johnson was refilling water glasses at table 12 when she noticed the commotion, her dark eyes taking in the scene with the sharp awareness of someone who had learned early in life to read danger in a room. At 28, she had been working at Bella Vista for 2 years while finishing her nursing degree, sending most of her paycheck home to help her mother raise her 2 younger brothers after their father left. She had grown up in the Riverside neighborhood, where survival meant knowing when to duck and when to stand your ground, where respect was earned through actions, not bank accounts, and where people looked out for each other because nobody else would. Marcus was now loudly complaining to Thomas about the temperature of the bread, his voice carrying across the restaurant as other diners tried to pretend they weren't listening, their conversations becoming forced and uncomfortable. The young server assigned to Marcus's section, a college kid named David, who worked weekends to help pay for his mother's cancer treatments, approached the table with visible nervousness, his hands trembling slightly as he set down the appetizer. Marcus looked up from his phone with irritation and immediately found something to criticize about how the plate was positioned, making David adjust it 3 times before grudgingly accepting it. Amara watched David's face grow red with embarrassment and felt something familiar stirring in her chest. The same feeling she got when she saw bullies picking on smaller kids in her neighborhood. The same anger that had driven her to stand up to her abusive stepfather when she was just 16. The other servers were giving Marcus's table a wide berth, finding excuses to work in different sections, leaving poor David to handle the impossible task alone. Marcus's 3 potential investors finally arrived, distinguished older men in expensive suits who seemed pleased to be dining at such an exclusive restaurant. But their smiles began to fade as they witnessed Marcus's treatment of the staff. He snapped his fingers to get David's attention, complained loudly about the speed of service, and sent back his salad because the dressing wasn't evenly distributed, all while trying to convince these men to invest millions in his company. The irony wasn't lost on Amara, as she watched this powerful man destroy his own business prospects with his cruelty. But what bothered her more was seeing David's confidence crumble with each harsh word. She had been in David's position too many times, had felt that helpless frustration of needing a job so badly that you endured treatment no human being should accept, and she knew that someone needed to draw a line in the sand. Marcus was building towards something explosive, his voice getting louder, his demands more unreasonable, and Amara could see the other diners beginning to look genuinely uncomfortable as they realized they were trapped in the same room with a man who seemed determined to make everyone around him as miserable as he was. The storm had definitely arrived at Bella Vista, and everyone could feel the pressure building, waiting for the moment when lightning would finally strike. The three investors sitting across from Marcus Whitfield were no longer hiding their discomfort as they watched him berate the young server David for bringing the wrong type of sparkling water, his voice echoing through the elegant dining room like thunder before a storm. Mr. Henderson, the eldest of the three men, leaned back in his chair with a frown that spoke volumes about his changing opinion of Marcus as a business partner, while his companions exchanged worried glances that clearly said they were having second thoughts about investing their money with someone who treated people so poorly. Marcus seemed oblivious to their reaction as he continued his tirade, demanding that David not only bring the correct water, but also explain why he had made such a basic mistake in the first place. His words sharp enough to cut glass, and twice as dangerous. The business meeting that was supposed to save his company was falling apart before his eyes, but instead of changing his behavior, Marcus doubled down on his cruelty, as if punishing the restaurant staff could somehow fix his professional problems. David stammered an apology, his young face flushed with shame as he hurried away to fix the water situation, nearly colliding with another server in his haste to escape Marcus's wrath. While the other diners in the restaurant tried to focus on their own meals but found it impossible to ignore the toxic atmosphere that seemed to be spreading from table to table like a disease. Marcus turned back to his investors with a forced smile, trying to pick up where their conversation had left off. But Mr. Henderson interrupted him with a cold voice that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Marcus, I have to ask, is this how you treat your employees at the company?" The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and Marcus felt his carefully constructed evening beginning to crumble around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. He tried to laugh it off, claiming that demanding excellence from service providers was just good business sense. But even as the words left his mouth, he could see that his explanation was making things worse rather than better. The second investor, Mrs. Chen, set down her fork with deliberate precision and said quietly, "We've heard rumors about your management style, but seeing it in person is quite different." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest as he realized that his behavior was costing him the very thing he needed most. But instead of backing down, his desperation made him even more aggressive, as if he could intimidate his way back into their good graces. He snapped his fingers at David, who was returning with the correct water, his movements careful and nervous as he approached the table that had already caused him so much grief. Marcus inspected the bottle like he was examining evidence in a criminal trial. Then, without warning, he erupted into his worst outburst yet, claiming that the water was too warm and accusing David of deliberately trying to ruin his important business dinner. His voice rose to a level that made conversation impossible at nearby tables, and several other customers began looking around for their servers, clearly planning to ask for their checks so they could escape the uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible. David's hands were shaking now as he tried to explain that the water had come straight from the refrigerated storage, but Marcus cut him off with a stream of insults that would have been cruel coming from anyone, but seemed especially vicious, coming from a man who had never worked a service job in his life. The young server's eyes began to well up with tears, and he mumbled another apology, but as he turned to leave, his elbow accidentally knocked against Marcus's wine glass, causing exactly 3 drops of the expensive vintage to splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire restaurant had suddenly been placed under a spell that froze everyone in place, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus stared down at the tiny wine stains, like they were blood from a mortal wound, his face turning an alarming shade of red as his fury reached a boiling point that everyone in the room could feel building like pressure in a steam engine about to explode. When he finally spoke, his voice was loud enough to be heard in the kitchen, and every word dripped with the kind of venom that could poison the air itself. He called David worthless, incompetent, and stupid, demanding that the manager fire him immediately for his clumsiness, threatening to have the entire restaurant shut down for employing such careless staff, his words becoming more cruel and personal with each passing second. David stood frozen in the middle of the dining room, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks as he endured the public humiliation that no human being should ever have to face, especially not for an accident so minor that it would normally be forgotten within minutes. The other diners sat in stunned silence, their own meals forgotten, as they watched this powerful man destroy a young person's dignity for sport. Too intimidated by his wealth and influence to say anything in David's defense, the manager appeared from nowhere, wringing his hands as he tried to calm Marcus down while simultaneously apologizing to David, clearly torn between protecting his employee and avoiding a confrontation with one of the restaurant's most influential customers. It was in this moment of collective cowardice, when everyone seemed frozen by the injustice unfolding before them, that Amara Johnson made a decision that would change everything. She set down her tray with deliberate care, her movements steady and purposeful as she walked across the dining room toward the table where Marcus continued his cruel performance, her heart pounding with the kind of adrenaline that comes before a fight you have to have, regardless of the consequences. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silent restaurant as she approached the man who had just proven that his money couldn't buy him decency, her mind clear and focused on one simple truth, that someone needed to speak aloud before this went any further. Amara Johnson reached Marcus Whitfield's table just as he was pointing an accusing finger at the trembling David and demanding that security escort the young server out of the building immediately. But when she cleared her throat and said in a voice that somehow managed to be both calm and commanding, "Excuse me, sir, but I need you to stop this right now," the entire restaurant fell into a silence so complete that even the kitchen staff stopped their work to listen. Marcus turned toward her with the kind of slow, deliberate movement of a predator sizing up new prey, his cold gray eyes taking in her simple black uniform and name tag, before his mouth twisted into a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever, clearly believing that this young black woman would be even easier to intimidate than the crying server behind her. "And who exactly are you to tell me what I need to do?" he asked, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension that he had perfected over years of believing that his money made him superior to everyone around him. But Amara didn't flinch or step back or show any of the fear that he was used to seeing in people's faces when he spoke to them that way. Instead, she stood straighter and looked him directly in the eyes, something that very few people had dared to do in recent years, and said, "I'm someone who works here, and I'm also someone who believes that every human being deserves to be treated with basic respect, regardless of how much money is in their bank account." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were shouted or aggressive, but because they were spoken with such quiet dignity that they seemed to expose something ugly and shameful about his own behavior that he had been trying to ignore for years. He felt his face flush with anger at being challenged by what he saw as a mere waitress, and he stood up from his chair so quickly that it scraped loudly against the floor, his height advantage making him tower over Amara, as he prepared to unleash the full force of his fury on this woman who dared to question his authority. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he snarled, his voice loud enough to make several diners at nearby tables actually lean back in their chairs. But Amara didn't move an inch, her steady gaze never leaving his face as she replied, "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Whitfield. But what I don't understand is why you think that gives you the right to treat people like they're less than human." Her words seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. And Marcus felt something strange happening inside his chest, a tightness that he couldn't quite identify as he realized that this woman was not going to back down no matter how much he threatened or intimidated her. He tried his usual tactics, mentioning his net worth, his connections, his ability to have people fired with a single phone call, but with each threat that left his mouth, Amara's expression remained unchanged, as if she was listening to a child throw a tantrum rather than a powerful man who could destroy her life with a few strategic phone calls. "Your money doesn't impress me," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying more authority than his shouting had. "And neither does your power, because what I see right now is a grown man bullying a young person who's just trying to do his job and support his family." The three investors at the table were watching this confrontation with expressions of amazement and growing respect for this young woman who was standing up to one of the most feared businessmen in the city, while other diners began to murmur their agreement with her words, creating a sound like distant thunder that seemed to roll through the restaurant from table to table. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he realized that the entire room was turning against him, that his wealth and influence meant nothing in the face of this woman's moral courage, and for the first time in years, he found himself at a loss for words. Amara took advantage of his silence to continue, her voice growing stronger as she said, "That young man behind me is working 2 jobs to help pay for his mother's medical bills, and he comes to work every day with a smile on his face, despite everything he's going through at home. But you've just humiliated him in front of a room full of strangers over 3 drops of wine that probably cost less than what he makes in an hour." Her words seemed to pierce through Marcus's armor of arrogance and strike something deep inside him that he had forgotten existed, a part of himself that remembered what it felt like to struggle, to be looked down upon, to need a job so desperately that you would endure almost anything to keep it. The restaurant was so quiet now that the only sounds were the gentle clink of silverware, as a few brave diners continued eating, and the soft sniffles from David, who was still standing nearby, with tears on his cheeks, but also with something new in his eyes that looked like hope. Amara's voice softened slightly, but her message remained crystal clear as she said, "I don't know what happened in your life to make you think this behavior is acceptable, but I do know that everyone in this restaurant, staff and customers alike, deserves better than what you're giving them tonight." Marcus felt something cracking inside his chest, not his ribs or his heart, but something deeper and more fundamental. Like the walls he had built around himself to keep the world at bay were suddenly crumbling under the weight of this woman's simple truth. He looked around the restaurant and saw the faces staring back at him, not with fear or admiration, but with disappointment and disgust, and he realized that in trying to prove his superiority, he had only succeeded in revealing his own emptiness. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, until finally Marcus sank back into his chair. The fight suddenly gone out of him as he faced the uncomfortable truth that this young waitress had just shown him a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw reflected there. Marcus Whitfield left Bella Vista that night without finishing his meal, without closing his business deal, and without saying another word to anyone. But Amara Johnson's voice followed him home like a ghost that refused to be silenced, echoing in his mind as he sat alone in his massive penthouse apartment overlooking the city lights that had once made him feel like a king but now seemed cold and distant as stars in a winter sky. For 3 days after the confrontation, he couldn't focus on work, couldn't return phone calls from his panicked business partners, couldn't even bring himself to eat the expensive meals his personal chef prepared, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw David's tear-stained face and heard Amara's calm voice, asking him what had happened in his life. To make him think such cruelty was acceptable. The question haunted him like a riddle he couldn't solve, sending him digging through memories he had buried years ago. Back to the time when he was just a scared kid, working in his father's failing diner, washing dishes for 12 hours a day, while rich customers treated him like he was invisible, making him understand for the first time in decades what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the kind of treatment he had been dishing out. Meanwhile, word about the incident at Bella Vista was spreading through social media like wildfire, but not in the way Marcus had expected, because instead of focusing on his wealth or power, people were talking about the brave waitress who had stood up to a billionaire bully, and the dignity she had shown even while confronting someone who could have destroyed her career with a single phone call. A customer named Jennifer Walsh had recorded part of the confrontation on her phone and posted it online with the caption, "This is what real courage looks like." And within hours, the video had been shared thousands of times, with comments pouring in from people who had their own stories about standing up to bullies or being bullied themselves. Marcus discovered the video on the 4th day after the incident, when his assistant nervously showed it to him on her tablet, and as he watched himself being confronted by Amara, he felt a strange mix of shame and fascination, like he was watching a stranger behave badly, while simultaneously recognizing that stranger as himself. The comments section was filled with people praising Amara's courage and grace. But what surprised Marcus most were the messages from his own current and former employees who began sharing their own experiences working for him. Some confirming his reputation as a difficult boss, but others revealing moments when he had shown unexpected kindness or fairness, painting a picture of a man who was more complicated than the monster he had become in his own mind. Sarah Martinez, who had worked as his personal assistant 5 years earlier, wrote about how Marcus had secretly paid for her daughter's surgery when her insurance wouldn't cover it, while Tom Bradley from the engineering department shared how Marcus had personally driven him to the hospital when his wife went into labor early, staying with him all night until the baby was safely born. These stories confused Marcus because he had forgotten about those moments of humanity, buried them under years of corporate ruthlessness and personal isolation. But seeing them written by other people made him realize that somewhere along the way, he had lost touch with the part of himself that was capable of kindness. He found himself spending hours researching Amara Johnson online, not to find dirt on her or plan revenge, but because he was genuinely curious about the woman who had seen something in him worth confronting, worth trying to reach through all his layers of anger and arrogance. What he discovered amazed him more than any business deal he had ever closed. Amara worked 3 different jobs while attending nursing school, sent money home to help her mother raise her 2 younger brothers, volunteered at a homeless shelter every Sunday, and had organized a community garden in her neighborhood that provided fresh vegetables to families who couldn't afford them. Her social media pages were filled with pictures of her helping elderly neighbors with their groceries, tutoring kids at the local community center, and participating in charity runs to raise money for various causes, painting a picture of someone who had turned her own struggles into strength that she used to lift up others around her. Marcus realized that while he had been using his wealth to intimidate and control people, Amara had been using her limited resources to make her corner of the world a better place, and the contrast between their life choices hit him like a punch to the gut. He began driving past the community center where she volunteered, not to confront her or cause trouble, but just to observe from a distance as she worked with kids who reminded him of his younger self, teaching them that they mattered and that their dreams were worth fighting for, something that no adult had ever told him when he was their age. The more he learned about Amara, the more he understood that her confrontation with him hadn't been about anger or revenge, but about seeing potential for goodness in him that he had forgotten existed, and the realization that someone still believed he could be better than his worst behavior made him feel something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. On the 7th day after the incident, Marcus made a decision that would have shocked everyone who knew him, including himself just 1 week earlier. He picked up his phone, called Bella Vista, and asked to speak with the manager, not to complain or threaten, but to ask for Amara Johnson's contact information because he wanted to apologize properly and maybe, if she was willing, learn how to become the kind of person who deserved the faith she had shown in him during their confrontation. The manager was so surprised by the request that he dropped the phone twice before managing to take down Marcus's message, and when he hung up, Marcus felt nervous excitement building in his chest like a teenager asking someone to prom, because, for the first time in years, he was about to do something that might actually matter. Amara Johnson was teaching 8-year-old Maria how to read when her phone buzzed with a message that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier. "This is Marcus Whitfield. I know you have every reason to ignore this, but I'm hoping you'll give me 5 minutes to apologize properly. Not at a restaurant, not in public, but wherever you feel comfortable. I want to understand how I became someone I don't recognize, and maybe learn how to be better." She stared at the text for a full minute, while Maria tugged on her sleeve, asking if they could continue with the story about the brave princess. And Amara realized that life had a strange way of presenting opportunities for grace when you least expected them. After discussing it with her mother and her best friend Keisha, both of whom thought she was crazy for even considering meeting with the man who had humiliated a coworker, Amara agreed to meet Marcus at the Riverside Community Center during her volunteer hours, telling him that if he wanted to see who she really was, he could watch her in her element rather than in some neutral coffee shop where they could pretend this was just a normal conversation. Marcus arrived at the community center 30 minutes early, sitting in his expensive car across the street and watching through the windows as Mara helped elderly residents with their computer classes, served lunch to homeless individuals, and organized activities for children whose parents were working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And with each passing minute, he felt smaller and more ashamed of the life he had built on the backs of people just like the ones she was helping. When Amara finally invited him inside, Marcus felt like he was entering a foreign country where the currency wasn't money but kindness, where respect was earned through service rather than fear, and where people looked at each other as family members rather than potential threats or opportunities for exploitation. She didn't make small talk or offer him coffee. Instead, she sat across from him at a small table in the corner and waited for him to explain himself, her dark eyes holding the same steady strength that had stopped him cold in the restaurant, but tempered now with something that looked like curiosity about whether he was capable of genuine change. Marcus found himself telling her things he had never shared with anyone. How his father's diner had failed when Marcus was 15, how they had lost their house and lived in their car for 3 months, how he had sworn that he would never be powerless again, and how that promise had gradually twisted into a need to make everyone around him feel as small and helpless as he had once felt. Amara listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that helped him dig deeper into the painful memories he had spent decades trying to forget. And when he finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, hurt people, but that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean you can't choose to do better starting right now." Her words were simple, but they hit him with the force of revelation, making him understand that his past could explain his behavior without excusing it, and that healing meant taking responsibility for the pain he had caused while working to ensure he never caused it again. Over the following weeks, Marcus began making changes that shocked everyone who knew him, starting with public apologies to David and the other restaurant staff, followed by a complete overhaul of his company's workplace policies to include better wages, mental health support, and zero tolerance for the kind of bullying behavior he had once considered normal leadership. He quietly paid for David's mother's cancer treatments and established a scholarship fund for service industry workers pursuing higher education, but more importantly, he began treating every person he encountered with the basic respect that Amara had demanded from him that night at Bella Vista. The transformation wasn't easy or instant. There were days when his old patterns tried to reassert themselves, when stress made him want to lash out at whoever was closest. But now he had Amara's voice in his head, reminding him that every person deserved dignity. And he had her example showing him what real strength looked like. Amara, meanwhile, found herself in the strange position of becoming an accidental mentor to one of the most powerful men in the city, helping Marcus channel his drive and resources toward causes that actually mattered, like the community programs she had been supporting with her spare change, while he had been hoarding wealth like a dragon guarding treasure. 6 months after their first meeting at the community center, Marcus surprised everyone by announcing the creation of the Second Chances Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to providing education, job training, and support services to people from underserved communities, with Amara Johnson serving as the program director while she finished her nursing degree. The foundation's first project was expanding the Riverside Community Center into a full-service facility with medical clinics, job placement services, and educational programs, creating opportunities for people who had been written off by society to rebuild their lives with dignity and support. Marcus still struggled with his past reputation and the temptation to use his wealth as a weapon rather than a tool for healing. But now he had something he had never possessed before, a purpose, beyond himself and friends who valued him for his character rather than his bank account. On the 1-year anniversary of their confrontation at Bella Vista, Marcus and Amara returned to the restaurant not as adversaries but as unlikely partners in the work of making their community stronger. And as they sat at the same table where their story had begun, David approached to take their order with a huge smile on his face and news that he had just been accepted to medical school with help from Marcus's scholarship program. The conversation that night wasn't about past mistakes or future plans, but about the small miracles that happen when people choose courage over comfort, compassion over cruelty, and hope over fear, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with someone brave enough to say this isn't right, and someone wise enough to listen when the truth finally finds its voice.